Did you know that you can have excessively elevated blood sugar without eating at all, even in a fasted state? And this may seem very confusing and bizarre if you've always operated under the assumption that blood sugar rises and falls depending on sugar or carbohydrate consumption. But there's a lot of other things that affect blood sugar, and sugar and carbohydrates is only a very small part of it. If you've been experiencing this issue, waking up first thing in the morning with really elevated blood sugar, not sure why, well, I want to explain why that is, what are the other things that affect blood sugar, and how to really resolve this issue as permanently as possible. Blood sugar control mainly requires adequate stress management. Okay? Poor stress management is actually the dominant driver of insulin resistance, which is the foundation of pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and even things like obesity in general. Okay? So, for example, let's say you're eating processed foods that are basically stripped of their micronutrients and water content as well as fiber, right? Eating foods like this not only would raise your blood pressure, but also raise your blood sugar. The reason why is because when you dump food into your system, especially something that's particularly dense, without the adequate level of water to accompany it, basically it's like dropping this solid mass like a brick into your gut. And your body kind of freaks out and panics a little bit. So your body will have to pull water from the other cells in your body, send that fluid to your gut in order to facilitate the digestion and nutrient absorption of that particular food. This is a stressor that can run your blood sugar up. This has nothing to do with sugar, but more to do with the molecular structure, the overall composition of what you just ate. Another example of something that has nothing to do with sugar that can actually cause your blood sugar to be perpetually elevated, and that is cooking. And in particular, not just cooking, but how you cook a food and what you cook the food in. So the two culprits that I'm referring to here is cooking with oil and cooking foods under high temperatures, okay? I'm going to start with the temperature. Now, for me, my go-tos are going to be things like steaming and boiling, which are the least inflammatory. The most inflammatory are things like frying, grilling, even sauteing, pan-searing, and things like this. Those dry, intensive heat cooking processes like the frying and the grilling and things like that, even baking that I just mentioned, that produces inflammatory agents, right? For example, that would be advanced glycation end products, which wreak havoc on your vital organs and lean tissue cells, robbing them of their electrons and breaking down their molecular structure, right? And as a result of this oxidative stress, you get an increase in inflammation. Then when you use those particular cooking processes and then you cook a food in oil, the oil also gets oxidized and becomes rancid and contributes to the inflammation. It's basically like a form of food poisoning at that point. So these things combined together not only would cause you to have excessively elevated blood sugar, but also excessively elevated blood pressure and contribute to the dehydration that I mentioned previously. And this is because not only is fat hydrophobic and dehydrating, but when you break down its molecular structure and turn it into a waste in this kind of way during that cooking process, all of that basically is just a stressor that can cause your blood sugar to be elevated in general. It has nothing to do with carbohydrates. According to that information there, the next question that likely popped into your head is, well, why is it that the frying, baking, and grilling and things of that nature are so deeply inflammatory, but the boiling and the steaming are not? And the difference between these two methods is just simply hydration levels, specifically how much hydration is in the food. When you're frying, grilling, and baking a food, you're actually dehydrating the food in that cooking process, okay? And a lack of hydration or dehydration is one of the primary drivers of oxidative stress and inflammation, which lead to excessively elevated blood sugar and blood pressure. When you're boiling and steaming a food, this has the opposite effect because you're taking water and heat and applying it to the food, allowing the water to enter into the food, hydrating it and making it more edible. Think about things like rice, quinoa, beans, lentils, peas, things like this, right? When they're not cooked, they're small, dry, and hard, pretty much making them inedible. And when you apply heat and water in the boiling and the steaming process, this causes the water to enter into the food and loosen up its molecular structure, making the nutrient contents of that food more bioavailable, right? Thus making it edible in general. That's the primary difference maker. The final example I'll touch on here is acid accumulation. And acid accumulation can happen whether you're exercising, fasting, or even eating foods or certain types of foods that increase acid accumulation. Acid is basically just a waste product or just a metabolite that results in some other type of biological function. Okay? So let's say you're doing muscular contractions, you're exercising, right? That produces things like lactic acid, which is a waste product as a result of energy expenditure. You can have something like fasting, which also produces acid as well. A lot more than just lactic acid. That would be one of them, but there are others as a result. And then you can eat foods that, for example, are high in fatty acids and high in amino acids, specifically, or just high in general, in fat and protein. Fat and protein aren't inherently bad. It just depends on how much of that stuff you're actually getting. Protein breaks down into amino acids. Those amino acids are used to create enzymes, hormones, new cells, things of this nature. But too much of those amino acids can actually be very toxic. You can't just have excessive levels of amino acids floating around in your bloodstream. It's very inflammatory, okay, because that can damage your cells, your vascular tissue, and things of that nature. It's poisonous over time. So your liver basically has to neutralize the acid content and convert whatever's left into something else usable. Same thing goes for fat, whether it be long chain fatty acids, short chain fatty acids, right? But those things have to be converted into something else or neutralized and stored, right? Protein isn't really particularly stored in the body, right? It's broken down into something else, and then it uses whatever it needs to be used, and then whatever waste is left over should be excreted from the body. Fat, your body does store, leading to things like obesity, right? Excess body fat gain. But essentially, when you eat fat and the fat is broken down into fatty acids, and those have to be used, and whatever is not used and left over, it gets stored inside your body, whether it be stored as subcutaneous fat, visceral fat, or just stored inside your liver and neutralized by your liver in order to reduce the acid accumulation as a protective mechanism. Now, I want to make it clear that protein and fat are not inherently bad. It just depends on the dosage and what it's paired with. Now, if you increase the fiber content as you increase the protein and fat content, it's a completely different story. And if you pair those fats and proteins with other alkalizing minerals like magnesium, manganese, potassium, iron, and calcium, those things act as a check-on or a buffer to the acid accumulation. And that takes the stress off of your liver and your kidneys and actually can help to reduce your blood sugar down to a healthy level. So this implies food choice. Our food choices are either going to be healing us or harming us, right? This is largely the dichotomy that we have to think about food in, okay? So generally speaking, we want to have foods in our diet that make up the majority of our diet, if not 100% of it, that solve all the other issues that I just mentioned, right? Waste accumulation, toxicity, dehydration, and balance, right? So your primary food groups here that are at the number one priority is going to be fruits at the top of the list, meaning the bulk of your food by weight and volume is going to be fruit. Number two, it's going to be nuts and seeds. Okay, and then number three is going to be leafy green vegetables. And then other optional forms of foods that are lower on the priority list are going to be things like whole grains, and legumes. Okay, when I say whole grains, I also include tubers and starches into that, whether it be rice, quinoa, buckwheat, or potatoes, yams, cassava, things of this nature. And then legumes, that's basically going to be your beans, peas, and lentils, for example. The more raw your diet is, the more water rich your diet is, the better the results will be. Okay? There's a very big difference between having a fully raw diet and having a cooked food diet. Generally speaking, I advise somewhere in the middle, right, which is high raw. You're not completely eliminating cooked foods. You're just shrinking it down to a much smaller portion in your diet. So what this would look like in a day would be your first 2 to 3 meals of the day would be raw meals, and then your final meal can have some cooked foods in it or just be a cooked meal in general. But you can also have more of a fully raw diet or a high raw diet that is almost entirely raw. An example of a diet that is almost entirely raw would be, let's say you eat all fruits, leafy green vegetables, nuts and seeds, but the nuts and seeds, for example, may be dry roasted. Okay, dry roasting is a cooking method. But if you're only including like around, let's say, 1, 2, 3, or even 4 ounces of nuts and seeds within your diet, this is going to be a very small, marginal form of cooking that's added into your diet. Interestingly enough, when you pair those dry roasted nuts and seeds with things like leafy green vegetables and fruits, the antioxidants and the water content and the fiber in the fruits and the leafy greens can act as a buffer against any of the toxins or inflammatory agents that would end up in your gut as a result of consuming those dry roasted nuts and seeds, or even nuts and seeds that are roasted in oil. You can include legumes, even raw legumes, in your diet. Okay, and an example of this would be sprouted legumes, like sprouted lentils or sprouted mung beans, where you're infusing them with water and allow them to go through a natural growth process called sprouting. And as they sprout, they become softer and more edible. And the nutrients become more bioavailable. And being that you're not cooking them, the fiber is not being lost in any type of cooking process. So you're getting the most amount of benefit out of a food like that. There's a variety of reasons why you would want to add some of these sprouted foods into your diet. If you want more protein, you want more zinc, you want more selenium, you want more iron and copper, you want the fiber from those legumes, right? You may want more thiamine, riboflavin, things like this, right? Those extra nutrients you can get from those foods, and they're also an alternative to certain nuts and seeds that you may have an allergy to. So that's very important. If you're allergic to nuts, then you may want to swap out the nuts for legumes, sprouted or otherwise. Then we've got fermented foods, and fermented foods are good to add into your diet because of the probiotic content, which is very beneficial for your gut health. Probiotics essentially are beneficial gut bacteria, also referred to scientifically as gut flora. And that bacteria is very important because they're messengers, right? They're little workers inside your gut, right? And so they're needed in order to facilitate enzyme production, hormonal balance, waste elimination, things of this nature, right? Your bacteria modulates your brain chemistry, your mood, muscle growth, blood sugar, all types of stuff. Even when it comes to things like appetite control and digestion, right? Your bacteria, your beneficial gut bacteria, make sure that those things are functioning properly. You may have heard of something called like Ozempic, which is basically a GLP-1 injection, right? Glucagon-like peptide 1. And this isn't just something that's manufactured in a lab that you inject into your body, but also this is a thing that's naturally produced inside your gut. And so your gut bacteria can secrete short-chain fatty acids that signal the secretion of this GLP-1 from your gut. And that leads to better appetite control and higher levels of fat metabolism and insulin sensitivity, among other benefits. So you may want to add things like, for example, coconut yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, and things of this nature in order to get that benefit. And you can add that with things like chia seeds, hemp seeds, flax seeds, and a variety of other different berries to make up this low glycemic meal that give you an abundance of vitamin C, all your B vitamins, vitamin K, the probiotics and the prebiotic fiber, as well as omega-3 essential fatty acids. Okay, so this is all about food choice and all the different types of benefits that you can get. Zooming out a little bit, we can talk further about macros, which people very commonly talk about, especially when it comes to blood sugar control. And so, broadly speaking, you have carbohydrates, fats, and protein. As a general rule for me, carbohydrates generally should be at least 50% of your macros. If you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, you'd want to raise that number a bit more, right? Where your carbohydrates is around 65 to 75% of your macros, even upwards of 80% of your macros, depending on how insulin resistant you are and how inflamed you are, okay? Your dietary fats can be anywhere from 15 to 20%. The more raw your diet is, though, the higher your fats will likely be. Right, to the point where if you're on a fully raw diet or an almost entirely raw diet, like I mentioned previously, your dietary fat can be even upwards of 25 to 30%. Okay? And then protein would be somewhere in between 10 to 16%. Protein doesn't really particularly need to be that high. So generally speaking, where I land is somewhere it's slightly above 10% and a little bit lower than 16%. So somewhere around, let's say, 12% or maybe even 14%. So those are good general guidelines that you can work within when structuring your diet. Last thing I want to cover on here is implementing herbal teas, right? Putting herbs and spices in your teas and using that in addition to your meals to further drive down oxidative stress and inflammation. How that would look is, let's say you wake up first thing in the morning and you can have moringa tea, all right? Or you can wake up first thing in the morning and have matcha tea. Okay, matcha tea is a bit iffy, and I wouldn't advise it necessarily for people who have caffeine sensitivity. Okay, so if you have a caffeine sensitivity, you may not want to do that. You may want to switch to something like ginkgo or ginseng or the moringa. The second meal of the day, okay, the second or the third meal of the day, along with that, you can have basil tea or tulsi tea. Okay, and this is a really good tool or really good herbal tea to battle or prevent infections, bacterial infections, fungal infections, viral infections. This reduces oxidative stress, inflammation, improves digestion, right? All different types of things. Really powerful stuff, right? So tulsi tea. For the, let's say, the third or the fourth meal of the day, typically the final meal of the day, you can have ginger turmeric tea. Ginger turmeric tea is extremely powerful. So what this would be is, let's say you have a mug, you boil some tea, and you take a quarter teaspoon, 1/4 teaspoon, and you scoop out a quarter teaspoon worth of ginger powder, plop it into the mug, quarter teaspoon worth of turmeric powder, plop it into the mug, and then fill the mug with around 8 to 10 ounces of the hot water that you've boiled. That is extremely powerful for reducing inflammation and oxidative stress. This works for blood pressure, blood sugar, joint pain, improving digestion by increasing stomach acids and digestive enzymes. I mean, this is really, really powerful stuff. Okay? And in addition to that, if you have, like, let's say, sleep apnea, or you have upper respiratory issues like asthma, right? You have low oxygenation in your lungs. You can add in cayenne pepper, right? Just like a pinch of cayenne pepper, a small amount. Cayenne pepper is really, really powerful stuff, and it is hot, okay? And you can add a pinch of that to the ginger and the turmeric and then pour the water in. And so basically that is like a really strong cocktail of just overall inflammation and oxidative stress elimination that you can have before that final meal. And this is a big deal for people who experience a lot of gas, bloating, constipation, or other different types of digestive issues or discomforts. And then lastly, finally, before bed, burdock root tea or chamomile tea. And those are some of the main suggestions that I would give. And those things cover oxidative stress and inflammation, blood pressure and blood sugar control, reducing inflammation of the joints, improving digestion, and then those bedtime teas in the form of burdock root and chamomile. Specifically, burdock root is a good detoxifier. It's a blood cleanser. It's a liver and kidney detoxifier. And it's also really good for increasing libido, giving you a healthy libido, and it helps men with nocturnal erections. So this helps to improve penile health, prostate health, and things of that nature. The chamomile tea is really good for producing a calming effect and reducing mental and emotional stress, overall inflammation, and getting higher levels of REM and deep sleep. One of the side effects that I've noticed also, and I don't mean side effect in a bad way, I mean just a side effect actually in a good way from the burdock root tea, is the burdock root also acts as a sleep aid as well. I noticed that in my experience, as well as the experience of others, drinking burdock root tea before bed at night causes you to have more deep sleep. Okay, so I put the burdock root and the chamomile kind of in the same category when it comes to having a calming effect, improving hormonal health, as well as detoxifying liver and kidneys, right? So this is very good for people with kidney disease as well, and blood sugar control, all that good stuff. So those herbal teas you can have along with your diet, and that would cover all aspects of your diet in the pursuit of optimal blood sugar control, along with overall health and wellness. There's a much more in-depth version of this video that I did for Tribe by Noir members. And that's where I added a diet plan. And we did live meal planning, showing you step by step what foods to put in each of the meals within that diet plan. And I break down the calories, the macros, the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber content, and all that kind of stuff. Okay. If you want content like that, where you want these informative videos along with a live meal plan being put together in real time to show you what your diet should look like as far as achieving these particular goals, join the Tribe by Noir community, become a tribe member, and I'll see you on the other side.